بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's well-known fact that the Gospels are the earliest sources on the crucifixion of Jesus. Of course, Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospels. They were written at least 20 years earlier than the earliest of the Gospels, which is the Gospel of Mark. But the problem, of course, with Paul's letters is that Paul did not meet Jesus, did not see him, did not accompany him. So he didn't know much about Jesus, as in directly from Jesus or about Jesus. And he wasn't actually interested in the history of Jesus either. So there's very little history in Paul's letters on the historical Jesus. He was interested in the, let's say, in the Messiah as the theological concept of the Messiah. The Christ. And then with respect to the crucifixion, which is of course pivotal in the theology of Paul, as in all really Christian writings, early and late, he didn't say much about the crucifixion beyond that. He was crucified and then he was raised from death, and he was seen after he was raised. So Paul is of no help whatsoever. And when it comes to information about the crucifixion, as in details about what happened exactly. So our only and earliest sources are actually the four Gospels. Now, the Gospels are also known to have all kinds of problems in there. So they have internal problems, so there are problems, contradictions, inconsistencies within each Gospel, but also among the Gospels. So the Gospels contradict each other on so many things. They also have conflicts in the way they describe what happened with the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus. They have conflicts with Jewish law, as in has more specifically the Mishnah laws, with how a Jewish trial would have been conducted. So there are they're basically the accounts in the Gospels just fell just about in every detail on the trial of Jesus. And also they contain on top of that historical fallacies, so historical wrong information that's basically historically wrong. And of course, none of this is new. This has been discussed by countless books, papers, all kinds of publications, and by countless people. I, for one, have published on this subject in a number of publications. One specific book I published is on the crucifixion of Jesus, called The Crucifixion of Jesus, Faithful History or Historical Faith. But of course, having said all of that, I should mention again a well-known fact that the Quran denies that Jesus was crucified. He wasn't, according to the Quran. But of course, historians, theologians, Jewish, Christian, etc., almost all agree that Jesus was crucified. Now, in this podcast, this is actually, I'm going to talk about kind of a new piece of information. You look at an issue that challenges the historicity of the crucifixion. More specifically, there's a new view among scholars about who was responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. So I'm going to talk here from the perspective, Western perspective, as in Jesus was crucified, in order to explain the serious failure that we have with a new view that Western scholars have developed. So for almost 2 millennia, the view, the consensus was that Jesus was crucified. The main people responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus were Jews, the Jewish authorities, and also actually supported by a Jewish mob, Jewish public. And then Pilate was just an unwilling participant. So effectively, the main culprits in the crucifixion of Jesus were Jews. And that is a natural, normal, rational reading of the Gospels. If you read the Gospels, you can't really kind of extract any other view, any other understanding other than what I've just described. This is why, for almost 2,000 years, this has been the reading of everybody, and nobody really disagrees with this. However, in the 20th century, a new view has developed, and this gradually gained kind of popularity until it's now more or less the standard view among Western scholars. This view questions and rejects the old view, and it moves the responsibility for the crucifixion from Jewish authorities and Jewish public to the Romans. And in summary, Jesus is said to have been a dangerous prophet, or was seen by Rome, by the Roman governor, as a dangerous prophet, as a revolutionary, and as a political threat. And as a result, Pontius Pilate moved then to crucify him. Why did this change happen in a view after 2,000 years? And why this view, which I'm going to show now, it goes completely against everything in the Gospels themselves. The reason and the motivation behind this view is that the Gospels, the natural reading of the Gospels, or accepting what the Gospel says, engenders and has engendered severe kind of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness. There's a lot of anti-Jews sentiments in the Gospels, as we will see. So really this view was a reaction to that. So set aside what the Gospels say and presented an alternative view. The problem with this new view is that it contradicts the Gospels completely, really completely. It effectively replaces the Gospel narratives with a new scenario, whereby the Jewish authorities were minor players or non-players, and the main blame for the execution of Jesus lies with the Romans. This new view of Western scholars, it's very important to realize, has no support whatsoever in any textual or oral tradition. It was made up out of thin air, literally. It has absolutely no support. All the traditions that we have are completely against this view. But what is important here for the subject of this particular podcast, what I'm trying to kind of explain here, is that this particular view, this new view about who was culpable for Jesus' crucifixion, really undermines the case for the historicity of the crucifixion. Because when Western scholars reject the account in the Gospels, and that account or accounts in the Gospels are our main and earliest sources, then there is actually nothing left to support the claim that Jesus was crucified. And, Western scholars could have actually dealt with the problem of anti-Jewishness in the Gospels in a completely different way and a more rational way. It's basically to say, whatever the Gospel said about the role of Jews in the execution of Jesus, must be put in its limited historical context at the time, and that's that. No other people, other Jews, after that, even at the time, who didn't take part in that, should be blamed for the execution of Jesus. It's just as simple as that. But that wasn't the solution that Western scholars went for. They went for something really, really radical, and as I'm going to show now, completely irrational, goes completely against the very case for the historicity of the crucifixion. And so it really is a kind of, what I would call, it's a reasonable reaction. It's an irrational reaction to a reasonable motivation, a good, good intention, but the action taken is completely irrational and completely disproportionate and completely unjustified. So let's have a look. Let's start by having a look at what the Gospels say about the responsibility for the execution of Jesus. Let's start with Mark. Mark is the earliest. I'm going to focus a little bit on Mark, but then we'll talk about the others kind of quickly. I don't want to kind of dwell for too long here. People can go and check for themselves the details. I would like to give more of an overview here. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, is believed to have been written around after 70 CE, after the destruction of the temple, around that time or so, but after that time, that event. And so it has still clear statements about what happened, who prosecuted Jesus, and who ultimately is responsible for his execution. According to the Gospel of Mark, Jewish leaders and a Jewish crowd instigated proceedings to have him crucified. So, for instance, Mark tells us the chief priests held a consultation with and I'm quoting now, with the elders and scribes and the whole council. The whole council means the Sanhedrin, the 71-member council, which is the Supreme Court, Jewish Supreme Court. So, and the quote goes on, they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So clearly, the main responsibility, who instigated the whole proceedings, everything, was Jews. Nothing to do with the Romans. That's what Mark says. So the Jewish accusers asked Pilate to execute Jesus, but he didn't find any justification for that, but he reluctantly obliged. And so Mark tells us, so the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. So he went on to say, then he answered them, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? Now, the custom that Mark is talking about here is supposedly there was a custom whereby the Roman governor would release on Passover a prisoner to the people. Now, this custom is actually unhistorical. It did not exist, but that's a different story. But that's really what this custom refers to here. So Pilate suggested that he should release for them the king of the Jews, which is how Jesus was introduced to him. So he wanted actually Jesus to be released. And then Mark goes on to say, for he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. So clearly Pilate didn't think anything badly about Jesus. He thought he was innocent, and that it was only jealousy by the Jewish authorities that was behind driving Jesus to him to get him executed. Mark goes on to say, but the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. So Barabbas was a prisoner, an insurgent, and the crowd apparently wanted that criminal to be released rather than Jesus, understandably, because the whole point about bringing Jesus to him, because they wanted him executed. And the mob here, the crowd, the Jewish crowd, was being manipulated by Jewish authorities, Jewish leaders. Then Mark goes on to tell us, Pilate spoke to them again. Then, what do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews? And then Mark says, they, as in the crowd, they shouted back, crucify him. And Pilate asked them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So as you can see, Mark insists that Pilate had nothing against Jesus, didn't want to hurt him in any way, let alone execute him. Yet the Jewish crowd, stirred up by their leaders, went for his execution. They wouldn't want anything other than him being killed. Mark then goes on to say, so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. And that was that. So there is really no ambiguity whatsoever about what Mark is telling us here. So this account in Mark blames the Jewish authorities and the Jewish crowd that was stirred up by those leaders to blame them for the execution of Jesus. Pilate was reluctant to do that, but he went along with what they wanted him to do. So that's Mark, the earliest of the Gospels. What do the other three Gospels say? Exactly, really the same. The outline of the story is the same in general. Matthew, however, goes even further than that, and he, in Matthew, has Pilate to declare his complete innocence of Jesus' blood. The Jews then, we're told, went on to say, his blood be on us and on our children. This catastrophic statement that Matthew attributes to Jews is considered to be behind much of the anti-Semitism, persecution, and really devastation that Christians put Jews through over the centuries. As for Luke, according to Luke, Pilate said that he could, quote, find no basis for an accusation against this man, referring to Jesus. Again, as you can see, he had no problem with Jesus whatsoever. But then Luke adds that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas. Now, Jesus obviously, at the time of the trial here, was in Jerusalem, but he spent most of his time in Galilee. Galilee was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. So what Luke says here, which is only found in Luke, that he sent him back to Antipas to see what he says about him. But Luke tells us that Herod Antipas, also exonerated Jesus. So as you can see, none to blame other than the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, as well as the mob that they have mobilized. John, the Gospel of John, exactly the same picture. Here, Pilate told the Jews that he could, quote, find no case against Jesus, meaning. Again, Pilate ended the trial by handing, and this is interesting here, because he handed Jesus over to the Jews rather than to his soldiers to be crucified. So John here further kind of incriminates the Jews because, like I say, Jesus was handed over to the Jews, back to the Jews rather than to Roman soldiers. So what is the summary that we get from the gospel narratives? The Jewish leaders indicted Jesus. They actually put him on trial, indicted him, wanted him to be killed. And I didn't really cover the trial, but it's very easy to go back and review what they did to him. So they tried him, indicted him, wanted him killed, and asked Pilate to do it. And the implication here is that the Jews did not have the legal power to execute Jesus. Pilate was not convinced at all by the case against Jesus because he didn't find him to have done anything deserving any punishment, let alone death. Anyway, the Gospels tell us Pilate bowed to the pressure from the Jewish authorities and other Jews, and he granted them their wish. So the priestly authorities initiated Jesus' prosecution, but then this ended up really becoming a popular case involving the Jewish public. This kind of summary reading of the Gospel is as clear as day. There's no other interpretation, no other reading that is possible. So when the new reading that developed in the 20th century to our days, which has become the standard kind of theory, alternative theory really, of what happened, it effectively rejects the narrative, the text of the crucifixion, trial, and all the details there in the Gospels. What it rejects effectively is the backbone of the narrative. This is the backbone of the narrative. And if you break that backbone, nothing is left of the narrative. The how, the why, the when, all must be rejected, or all rejected according to this non-existent alternative, the alternative that was introduced by Western scholars, which has no foundation in any tradition. So the problem here is that they reject the earlier sources of the crucifixion narrative, yet they insist that the crucifixion is historical. And as I mentioned earlier, all they needed to do really to get rid of this devastating impact of the anti-Jewish sentiment, clear and strong and severe anti-Jewish sentiments in the Gospel, it's simply just to say these are, happened. They describe a situation that happened at a particular point in time in ancient history. It's completely illogical, irrational, actually, for these sentiments actually to kind of propagate throughout the centuries and to be kind of to be acted on and to become the motives behind the persecution of Jews. That's all. But what they've gone for is a solution, is a radical solution. Now, the problem with this solution, as I will become even clearer, is that it's incoherent, it's preposterous, it's irrational, because what it says, I'm going to reject everything effectively, 90%, 95% of the details of the crucifixion narrative in our main sources on the crucifixion. But I will continue to believe that Jesus was crucified. Completely and utterly self-contradictory, irrational, preposterous, makes no sense. But the problems with this new view does not end here. There is no gospel-based scenario that can exonerate the Jews at the time and criminalize Pilate instead. It's impossible. But the broader issue, the kind of, we have more problems there because the crucifixion narrative is connected to earlier kind of details in the Gospels. So it's an extension of Jesus' earlier history in the Gospels. More specifically, Jesus is reported to have conflicts with two Jewish groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees, it's a small group of people, like about 6,000 or so, according to the Jewish Roman historian Josephus. The Pharisees were interested and focused on the interpretation of the Mosaic law and the observance of the Torah. That's really what they're interested in. They didn't get involved with the governors, didn't care what happened beyond that. That's their main interest. And the other group that Jesus had also conflicts with is the Sadducees. This is a smaller group, but there's very little information about it beyond that they were aristocrats and they were associated with the priesthood. They were in charge of the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. Now, I might mention as well, Jesus did not belong to any of this group. In fact, most Jews at the time did not belong to any of these groups. These are like groups of scholars, let's call them, in the same way you have a smaller minority in society who are scholars, everyone else is not. So the conflict with the Pharisees reported in the Gospels repeatedly throughout the mission of Jesus centered, as you would expect, around the law, the Mosaic law. Because there are a number of narratives or incidents whereby the Pharisees accused Jesus and his disciples of breaking the law. That's not really the view of most scholars now, because there are the incidents can be understood and interpreted in a way that show that Jesus did not really intend to break the law, the Mosaic law. In fact, he observed the Mosaic law as his disciples did, but that's a different story. However, because of that, again, view, which was the view of Christians until recently, and still a lot of Christian scholars believe that Jesus actually did not follow, does not need, and Christians do not need to follow the law. Some think that this was behind his crucifixion, but that is a really tiny minority, so we can't ignore it. And it's not historical anyway. But the two reasons that most scholars think were behind his execution have to do with his conflict with the Sadducees, who were in charge of the temple. There were two reasons. The first is a prophecy that he made, which basically goes something like that in Mark. I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Now, this wasn't Jesus actually talking about something he was going to do. He was actually just pronouncing a prophecy. It's nothing to do with him. So it's not like he said, I am going to destroy the temple. So they had to stop him from destroying the temple. And frankly, for anybody to make this claim, it would have been just absurd for anybody, one single person, to decide to destroy the temple. How do you do that? It's ridiculous. It's absurd. So this could not have been actually. So it wasn't, to start with, something Jesus claimed about himself as something he was going to do, and it made no sense. It could not have been a cause for the crucifixion of Jesus, even though that's what scholars think. It's one of the reasons. The second, and this is more serious, it's the direct cause of his execution, according to Western scholars. He he basically went into the temple and he caused a major disturbance. He attacked traders in the temple. And I'm going to read the account according to Mark here and make a few comments about it. He entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Jesus argued that obviously this is the house of prayer, not den of robbers, as he put it. So, and then Mark goes on to say, when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, as in heard the commotion and heard what Jesus was doing, when they heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. So as you can see, the gospel, Mark here claims that this was a direct cause for the Sadducees to try and seek the execution of Jesus. Now, the problem again with this account is completely unrealistic. So, the temple covered a huge area, usually estimated to be between 26 to 36 acres. This is huge. Most of that area was what is known as the court of the Gentiles, because Gentiles could also enter there. And that is actually the area where Jesus was supposed to have created this commotion, going around kicking every table, etc., that he saw. Now, that area and the temple in general was protected by armed guards. He would have been immediately arrested. He could not have created any sustained kind of commotion or attack on anyone else in there. He would have immediately picked up by the guards there. And Jesus being a wise man, at least to say the least, he was wise enough to know his action would have been completely futile. Indeed, nothing happened as a result of what he did. The practice there in that area continued as is. Nothing changed, according to history, until the temple was destroyed 40 years later. So it just didn't make any sense. It wouldn't have made any sense to Jesus to attempt anything like that. I mean, you can understand if he went there preaching, telling people about certain things specifically that were wrong, not everything, because this place, the court of the Gentiles, was actually the place where people who came to visit for their pilgrimage to visit the temple, foreigners exchange foreign currency for shekels because they needed to pay the temple tax. Also, it is in that very area sacrificial animals were being sold. So people had to buy and then do their sacrifices. So Jesus' action, according to the Gospels, would have actually stopped the temple from operating as a place for offering sacrifice. It didn't make any sense. So both concerns, again, these two, they are unrealistic. He did not mean that he was going to destroy the temple, and he could not have attacked those traders the way at least described in the Bible. He wasn't a violent person anyway. What happened to him to suddenly lose his mind and commit something that's completely irrational, completely futile, and can only hurt him and would not fix the problem supposedly he was trying to fix? Completely irrational and historical meaning. But both of these, on top of that, would have concerned the Jewish authorities, but not the Romans. Remember, he is said to have attacked traders, not Roman soldiers. He didn't attack any of these. He is not even reported to have attacked Jewish guards there. He only attacked traders. And this is consistent with the general story of conflicts that Jesus had with Jewish authorities, but not with Roman authorities. So that's very clear now. Further, another very extremely important critical observation: the Jesus did not, according to the Gospels, say or did anything that would have drawn the attention of the Romans, let alone alarm them, let alone make them decide to kill him. Absolutely none. Much of this conflict that we read about, and the criticism we read about in the Gospels, all the criticism was actually with Jewish authorities, of Jewish authorities. Conflict was with them and about them. Not a single one was with the Roman authorities. Furthermore, He is not reported to have had any political activity. He did not advocate violence, which is why I said what this kind of the scene that he attacked the traders. It's a completely nonsensical. So there was no violence, and he was actually little known. According to the Gospels, again, our main and earlier sources, remember about the crucifixion, that we're told all over and over again that we cannot deny it. But notice how Western scholars denied just about everything about it, about this story, other than the claim that Jesus was crucified. Completely nonsensical. So Jesus, in fact, the Gospels tell us that the Jewish authorities had to alert Pilate about Jesus. He wasn't aware of him. He had no idea about him. So he caused no alarm. Jesus was not known to the Roman authorities. And then, obviously, consistent with this, when the Jewish authorities took Jesus to Pilate, they had actually to explain to Pilate why they brought Jesus to him. He had no idea why. And they kept on kind of arguing with them. Even after Jesus was introduced to him and the accusations against him were put in front of him, he continued to argue. He couldn't see any case for those accusations. But on top of that, and you can see there's numerous arguments against this view taken by Western scholars, the alternative view to what happened in the Gospels. According to the Gospels, there were actually two encounters before Jesus was taken to Pilate. There were only two encounters Jesus had with Romans. One of them, it was an encounter with a centurion. Centurion, as a Roman military officer, he came to Jesus, having heard about his miracles and the healings, etc. And he asked him to heal his very ill slave. He had a slave was very ill, and Jesus did. So that's one. And the second is Jesus was challenged by the Pharisees and others about paying taxes to the Romans, because that was a big issue for the Jews, how Jews would pay taxes to Gentiles. So he was challenged on that to try and entrap him and get him to say something against the Roman authorities. But look at his famous words: "Give to the emperor," I'm quoting now, "give to the emperor, the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." Period. These are the two encounters that Jesus had with the Romans or about the Romans. That's it. And in both cases, it's clear that he had no conflict. He didn't attack the Romans. He didn't say anything. He didn't even criticize the Romans, let alone start a revolution against the Romans and becoming an insurgent and all this nonsense, really. It's nonsense, nothing more than that. He was a peaceful Messiah, and he did not claim to be a king, an earthly king. So what was Pilate's role then in what happened? Again, according to the Gospels. Remember, we're talking here all according to the Gospels. In the synoptists, so Mark, Matthew, and Luke, when Pilate asked Jesus whether he was the king or a king of the Jews, Jesus answered, "You say so." You said so. He didn't say anything. That's claim you're making because the Jews who accuse me of this told you that. In John goes one step further, and he has Jesus talking about his kingdom being the kingdom of God, a spiritual kingdom. So it wasn't talking about kingdom on earth, a political kingdom. That's not what it was. In fact, and this also is confirmed in what Pilate said to the Jews referring to Jesus, and he called him, according to Mark and others, the man you call the King of the Jews. Notice how he attributes this title to the Jews. It's not to him. It's not to his assistants, military officers. Nobody came to a Roman, came to Pilate and said, no Roman official came and said to Pilate that Jesus, there's somebody called Jesus who's causing problems, or potentially could cause a problem. There's absolutely none. Even after the accusation, all of that, Pilate continued to say, is the man you call the King of the Jews. He wasn't, meaning after talking to Jesus, Jesus didn't call himself King of the Jews. You actually calling him that because you want to accuse him of that. But of course, again, staying within the context and narrative of the Gospels, Pilate did not, whether Pilate believed the Jews or not, and he did not believe them about Jesus, it's kind of immaterial because he actioned what they wanted. So he still went ahead and crucified Jesus. So that was just a response to what the Jews wanted. But clearly, he didn't care killing one innocent person. Pilate was very, very brutal. His history in sources and Josephus is really very, very brutal indeed. So, killing one innocent people wouldn't counted anything. He would have been more than happy to do that. And we know, of course, that Pilate did not prosecute Christians after killing Jesus. Now, ask yourself, if he actually killed Jesus because he thought Jesus was a revolutionary, an insurgent, potential political threat, etc. He had followers. Well, he didn't go after any of his followers. Why? Why would he do that? Doesn't make any sense. Again, because he actually knew that Jesus did not pose any threat to the authorities, Roman authorities. But what's significant here is that by Western scholars making the Romans responsible for the execution of Jesus, not the Jewish authorities, they destroy not only the crucifixion narrative, which is all we have in those Gospels about the details of how, why, etc. Jesus was crucified. So they don't destroy only the crucifixion narrative, but they also destroy most of Jesus' biography, life, according to the Gospels, as in before the trial, before he was arrested, etc. Because that's what we're told in the earlier part of Jesus' life, pre-arrest, etc., is that he had absolutely no conflict with the Roman, lots of conflict with the Jewish authorities. What makes things even worse? Scholars actually, and I'm talking about Western scholars here, already think that around less than 20% of the sayings that are attributed to Jesus in the Bible are actually authentic, as in probably go back to Jesus. Less than 20%. Now, if you then add this, so they dismiss that much as well of his sayings, and they say his main conflict was with the Romans, and they obliterate the crucifixion narrative, what is left of the Gospels? Hardly anything. Really, really hardly anything. That's what we are told we are supposed to believe about the Gospel, about Jesus, which is basically this: do away with the Gospels, do away with 80%, 90% of the Gospels, and believe in the story I'm going to give you about Jesus now. But you can't deny the crucifixion. I, as a Western scholar, I have the right to deny the authenticity, the veracity, truthfulness, historicity of 90%, over 90% of what of the history of Jesus in the Gospels. But you do not have the right, you as a Muslim, or indeed anybody else, you don't have the right to deny that Jesus was crucified. How absurd this position is. It's extremely absurd. It really is. Now, one thing I have to mention here, that crucifixion, and it's always a point made by Western scholars, and it's of course a valid point, crucifixion was a Roman punishment, not a Jewish punishment. I mean, there was kind of few instances in Jewish history of crucifixion being used by Jews, but really rare. But crucifixion was a standard Roman crucifixion. But then, so why was he crucified rather than stoned, for instance, by the Jews? Because the Jews had no power, legal power, of capital punishment. That's why. That's what the Gospels say. They had to take him to the governor. Of course, Western scholars actually kind of split on this. Did they or did they not have legal power of capital punishment? But the majority, I think, believe the Jews did not have, and I share that view. I don't think they did. That's a different story. Might speak about it on different podcasts. So they had to take him to the Roman governor. In fact, I think in John, John mentions explicitly that the Jews tell, I think, Pilate that they did not have the power to execute Jesus, which is why they brought Jesus to him. Now, obviously, another silly thing in this story, in the Gospel, is to show Pilate as so weak, and the Jews kind of egging on him, pressurizing him to execute Jesus. Well, they couldn't have done that. If anything, they were scared of him because he was brutal and he had the power. They didn't have any of this. They were the weak side. So the image kind of that painted in the Gospel is an historical. So what we could tell is that the Jews would have petitioned Pilate to do what they wanted, to do the dirty job for them, to kill Jesus. But it's not possible to go with the scene as you find in the Bible, where Pilate really feeling kind of under pressure to give the Jewish authorities what they wanted. But then we can understand why Pilate went ahead with that and agreed to do, because he didn't care about that one single person. Even if that innocent people was not a potential insurgent, but he could have used it to make an example of him. And just to remind everybody what awaits potential insurgents, anybody who might lead any sedition against the Romans. But like I said, he did not persecute any of his followers. Why is that? Clearly, he didn't actually believe there was any danger at the time, but he wanted to do that to send the message, if you like. He would have been more than happy to do that. Another potential reason, I think, and a realistic reason, is that he wanted to maybe do a favor to the high priest at the time. So that's another possibility. But effectively, it was used as a reminder. Pilate used it as a reminder to potential challenges to the Romans. And that's why he did it for them. He did not have to do it. I actually discussed this whole subject in more detail in my book, The Crucifixion of Jesus. There's a very detailed chapter there for anybody who's interested in that. So, if I would kind of summarize the implication of the new view, the common view now among Western scholars, that the execution of Jesus, the person or side responsible for that was the Romans, specifically Pilate. The implication for the Gospels is that blaming the Romans destroys the reliability of the earliest and only accounts of the crucifixion beyond repair. Absolutely beyond repair. It completely shatters those accounts. On top of that, blaming the Romans also rejects much of the pre-trial, arrest, trial, and crucifixion account of Jesus in the Gospels. So much of his biography, life, mission before he was arrested. That amounts to a complete destruction of the Gospels. The Gospels are already riddled with problems, as I mentioned quickly earlier. The last thing they would have needed is for Western scholars then to reject much, and I repeat, much of what's found in those Gospels about Jesus. Now, with respect to the new view, as I mentioned earlier, there's no evidence whatsoever of any conflicts that Jesus had with the Romans. When I say no evidence, no oral, no textual evidence. In fact, there is no evidence that the Romans had any awareness, any knowledge of Jesus. So what happened here really is that Western scholars came up with an assumption, which is to blame the Romans for the execution of Jesus, and then developed justifications for that. And the justification here being he was a revolutionary. But that was not, he was not said, he was like a challenge, a political challenger to Rome. So what perceived so. Not because there's any evidence there. No. This actually a kind of necessary conclusion from an assumption. The assumption being that the Romans were culpable, the party responsible for the execution of Jesus. So an assumption was adopted as a fact, and then evidence was manufactured for that assumption. It's as bad as it sounds. It really is. And if I would kind of try to give an example of how bad the situation is, at the scale of this kind of attempt of kind of replace history, if you like, at least history as recorded in the Gospels. Imagine the book of the the book of the Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, where and the story about the conflict between Moses, who was leading the Israelites, and on one side, and Pharaoh. And imagine somebody then coming and saying, well, I'm not convinced that what happened. I think what happened is that there were kind of traitors among the Israelites who actually caused this suffering that the Israelites were going through, and Pharaoh was only just helping them. Yeah, that's effectively what. Imagine if somebody would read the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, with its details in this manner, in this stupid manner, absurd manner. That is the equivalent. I'm just trying to give an idea about how really incredible this consensus or a majority view of scholars, Western scholars, this new view of Western scholars, relatively new. And this view does not reflect scholarship, proper scholarship of the Gospels, of the New Testament or Christianity or history. Anybody does this kind of work is not doing, any scholar does this kind of work, cannot claim to be doing gospel studies, studying the New Testament, studying Christianity, or doing history. What they are doing really is a genre of fiction called alternative history. This is what it is. It's alternative history, just like creative writing, if you like. That's what it is. So the position here, as I mentioned, of Western scholars, those who adopt this view, this position, is a complete contradiction, and it's a mutually exclusive, because on the one hand they have only this one sources on the crucifixion and the details of what happened, and then they deny almost everything there, turn it upside down, and then they go and replace it with alternative details, and they tell us, but the one fact nobody can deny is the crucifixion of Jesus. It's just absurd, like I say. The problem is that what they are doing here, not a contradiction, in that it's a mutually exclusive. You can't have these two, or as the kind of centuries old idiom would go, you can't have your cake and eat it. You really can't. This dilemma that Western scholars have, you can describe it as a crisis, contradiction, incoherence, or even absurdity. That's what it is. The motivation, as I mentioned earlier, it's a reasonable, there's good intention, which is basically to combat anti-Semitism, but the response is irrational. The motivation is reasonable because of the history of anti-Jewish sentiments, etc. But the response is completely irrational. But what we should also see here is a stunning example of how fear of anti-Semitism makes people deny even history. Because for those scholars, the Gospels are talking history. They describe what happened, and for centuries everybody believed that this is history. So what happened here is that fear of anti-Semitism made them deny history. I'm not aware of any other similar example, actually, whereby the fear of any certain bad, negative, damaging, of course, sentiments or feelings like anti-Semitism, and as evil as it is. But I'm not aware of any similar example whereby, in order to kind of confine or limit or control or eliminate those negative, bad, evil motivations, feelings, sentiments, then one would go ahead and deny history. The only one example that I can think of is actually a recent example, which is what's happening today, where we see with our own eyes, we hear the news, everybody sees what's going on in Gaza and Palestine. The genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the extermination by violence, by starvation, you name it. But there are a lot of people still out there who wouldn't even point the finger at Israel's ongoing crimes against humanity and call them for what they are, because they fear of being called anti-Semitic. And of course, tons of people have been called anti-Semitic just because they called genocide. And the reason, because if they had called another genocide, nobody would have cared. But because this genocide is committed by Israel, then it's anti-Semitic if you call it genocide. Brilliant, isn't it? Such a nice situation we're in. Very fair. And then, so people would actually even fear coming out to call those crimes by their proper name because of fear of being called anti-Semitic. That is effectively the equivalent of denying history, because there are people who deny, so not only silent and refuse to come out and condemn these crimes against humanity, but there are people who see them on TV, you see them on YouTube, everywhere, newspapers, who actually deny Israeli genocide of being genocide, denies the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. They don't call it ethnic cleansing. I don't call extermination by violence and starvation and other means as what they are, crimes against humanity. So what they are doing effectively, these people are falsifying history that we all live and see. It's not ancient history, because using anti-Semitism as a tool, as a method. Thank you for watching. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.